Okay, great. Um, Excited to begin Chumash Vayikra with all of you, and we move to a new study partner slash teacher slash text in the form of Rabbi Shmuel Golden's books. Um, he was the rabbi in Englewood for many, many years of Ahavat Torah, and a wonderful senior colleague, and built a phenomenal community there, made Aliyah, and I find, as always, it's a new and different flavor. Um, Very few texts in these little essays are quoted um, inside, as they say. He alludes to a wide range of commentaries, but doesn't cite them in the original, but gives us the source references if we want to follow up ourselves. Um, and tackles topics within the Parsha, and kind of the kinds of questions that an inquisitive person not taking the Torah for granted might ask. Some of the analysis feels a little familiar from, some of our kind of literary analyst style commentaries, kind of from the Yeshivat HaKibbutz Hadati school that we've talked about, that Rav Meidan is connected to, and that Dr. Elitzor, who we just completed, utilizes. Sort of feels like a hybrid between that on the one side and maybe Rabbi Shai Held on the other side, in terms of, English essays on themes that are meant to speak to us in a contemporary lens, without the philosophers, the non-Jewish philosophers, and biblical critics that Rabbi Shai Held might quote, and with much more of a traditional bent, but also an open-minded approach. What I appreciate the most is just kind of the honest asking of questions, and even if or as the answers fall towards the traditional side, but we encounter a range of views. You get a really beautiful flavor of the diversity of Rishonim and Achronim, with reference to rabbinic texts as well, but we get a sense of the medieval and modern commentaries, traditional commentaries, and their approaches, and again, with the opportunity to sort of follow up and see them inside on our own if we want to. And at the end, he really tries to make it readable and accessible, so it's broken down into small sections. There's a kind of little passage at the beginning which lays out the context, and then often lengthy sections towards the end called points to ponder, which are more personal narratives, experiences from his life's work in the pulpit rabbinate, that I think bring the experiences to the current moment. So again, it'll be less, maybe in a way less dense or sophisticated than some of our other essays, but in a different way speaks more directly to the more classic questions we might ask on the text, not on narrow interpretation, but on broader topics that the text brings up. And we're not going to go through his introduction, but you have that linked in the email as well. And he sort of says there, everybody said to me, like, okay, your books on Bereshit and Shemot are great, but what are you going to do when you get to Vayikra? And his argument was the same thing I did before, engage the topics head on, use the commentaries and the tradition, and try to make sense of them for the current day, just instead of, it being our classic narratives, it's going to be legal texts and rituals that may be more foreign and less familiar to us, but our work is the same. Maybe it's harder, but it's the same work. So that's how I would introduce it. And since we got a late start, we'll particularly jump right in. The essays tend to be a little shorter than some of our previous sets, so hopefully we'll be able to cover them in a good amount of time and have time for questions or discussion. There tend to be, as opposed to some of our more recent authors that we've studied who had only one comment on the Parsha, he tends to have 2 or 3 essays. So the question David Lowenfeld sometimes asks me of, why did you choose this one? It could be a relevant question to ask in this book, because I did try to choose the ones that I think felt the most appropriate or speak the most to us today or address a challenge we feel today. I would say amongst the different, books we've read, I really recommend this one. I only have the volume on Vayikra now, but I plan to buy the others put them on my shelf. I think they're great companions for the Parsha, great ways to open up discussion at a Shabbat table. So I really highly recommend. So here we are, confronting Korbanot and the context. With the opening of the book of Vayikra, we enter the world of Korbanot. By the way, with Rabbi Shai Held, we did Vayikra. With Rabbi David Foreman, we did Vayikra, and they open in the same general way. How are we meant to make sense of this sacrificial system? In chapter upon chapter of text, God commands the newly formed Jewish nation, encamped at the foot of Mount Sinai, concerning the rituals that will define the sacrificial rite in the sanctuary. Questions. The very existence of Korbanot creates a powerful quandary. On the one hand, no area of Torah law seems more alien to modern sensibilities than that of Korbanot. As we confront the Torah's sacrificial rite, we find ourselves at a total loss, unable to relate to these seemingly primitive rituals, wondering why an all-powerful, incorporeal God would demand the offering of animals and grain in God's worship. On the other hand, we cannot deny that the sacrificial rite is an integral part of Jewish law. Not only are substantial portions of Torah text dedicated to detailed descriptions of Korbanot, but these rituals apparently remain to this day a critical component of our national aspirations and dreams. Jewish liturgy is replete with prayers seeking the rebuilding of the temple and the reinstatement of the sacrifices. He's going to circle back to this at the end. An honest approach towards the Torah text, and again, that's his, how he presents himself, taking an honest approach, demands that we not ignore the existence of Korbanot. The questions raised by these puzzling rituals must be dealt with head on. Why does God demand offerings of animals and grain as part of God's worship? An all-powerful, transcendent God certainly has no need for physical gifts from man. Does the Torah-mandated sacrificial rite speak to us on any level today? Can any relevant lessons be learned from these seemingly archaic rituals? Do we really desire a return to the practice of Korbanot? I think these are great questions to ask as we enter into the book of Vayikra. So we begin with approaches. Historical development. Our analysis begins as it should at the beginning, with a brief review of the historical development of Korbanot as described in the Torah. This review reveals a number of surprising and significant points, right? And here he's already, offering us a methodology which is familiar, which is when you encounter something in the text, you ask, is this really the first time we're seeing it? On the one hand, this is the first organized, laid out, expansive system of korbanot, but it's not the first time a korban has been offered in the Torah. So, what can we learn from looking back at those earlier instances? This is what we did with Rabbi David Foreman last year also. He analyzed some of the first korbanot to try to get a sense. If you recall, I didn't, but I refreshed my memory today. His analysis focused on three central korbanot, olah, chatat, and shlamim. And he suggested that they were there to cultivate three modes. The olah, which is the fully burnt offering, is kind of about the negation of the self and the posture of awe, which really says, the entire universe belongs to God, and I'm nothing in it. And Akedat Yitzchak, which was the olah, is sort of the model for that. The chatat sort of says, when I do something wrong, I transgress the boundary between that which belongs to me and that which belongs to God. I have to compensate by giving something of mine sort of back to God, and that's the model of the chatat. And I don't remember what the biblical parallel or set text that he offered for that. And then the shlamim is in order to strengthen my relationship with God, I actually want to try to share something with God, share in a fellowship experience, where God has some of the meat and I have some of the meat, and in that way we're somehow having a combined meal of sorts, and that sort of covenantal partnership. So these three different modes of relating to God through the three. And we'll see that Rabbi Golden kind of suggests, yes, this is a direction one could go in an interpretation, get specific on the specific sacrifices and what they each might symbolize, but he wants to stay on the broader plane for his analysis. So, the first textually recorded physical offering to God is brought during the second generation of man's existence, by Cain, the eldest son of Adam and Chava. Cain is promptly followed in this act by his brother Hevel. As we have noted previously, and we'll see he will refer back to his earlier essays in some of the places here, the Torah's testimony concerning God's selective acceptance of these offerings is particularly telling. And God turned to Hevel and his offering, but to Cain and to his offering, God did not turn. The language seems superfluous. The Torah could have made its point by simply saying, "And God turned to Hevel's offering," while to Cain's offering God did not turn. Why specify that God turned to Hevel and to his offering, but not to Cain and to his offering, right? It's the offerer and the offering that seem to be acknowledged in each case. Apparently, with the very advent of man's physical offerings to the divine, God wants to establish that God will not consider these rituals in a vacuum. God does not accept or reject korbanot, or for that matter any ritual observance, arbitrarily. God bases God's judgments upon the motivations and actions of the supplicant. While the Torah is not clear why, and of course this is an enormous question for analyzing that story, which he does back in Breshit, something in Hevel's behavior moves God to accept him and his offering. Conversely, Cain's conduct apparently merits divine rejection. Cain is unable or unwilling. By the way, in one of the footnotes here, he points out that we're starting with the story of Cain and Hevel. The Gemara suggests that Adam Harishon offered korbanot, but he says here, we will limit our discussion to the evidence of textual pshat, right? And that's an important point he makes in the introduction, which again, you have in a separate link in the email, that we will study pshat and drash, but we will be clear to differentiate between them. Cain is unable or unwilling to appreciate the ramifications of this rejection. Paralyzed in the face of the divine demand for personal introspection and behavioral change, he instead lashes out against his brother with tragic consequences. Again, this warrants much further discussion, but he just wants to use it as a springboard to his study of korbanot in Vayikra, so we're doing it in brief. With the first appearance of ritual worship in the Torah, God immediately places such worship in its proper context. Through a seemingly simple turn of phrase, right, the person and their offering, as opposed to just the person's offering, God communicates that God does not seek meaningless, arbitrary acts from man, but instead thought-filled, meaningful religious devotion. So that's sort of point or pattern number one. A korban is related to the bringer and their motivation, etc. Another telling continuing pattern is initiated in the Torah with the offerings of Cain and Hevel. From this point on, until the birth of the Jewish nation with the exodus from Egypt, this is sort of an obvious point, but one I never really sat down and thought about till I saw it here. All korbanot emerge in the Torah as human, initiated events. Driven by a desire to communicate with an unfathomable God, early man of his own accord develops a sacrificial rite. Now, it's not a rite in the sense that we have the sense that it's so heavily ordered or structured. We don't have the sense of a system that we're aware of in the time of the patriarchs and matriarchs, but still, the practice in some form seems to develop spontaneously. Again, obviously likely was part of the ancient Near Eastern world in which they were part, as we'll see more of, but it never seems to be divinely mandated, but rather human initiated. Noach, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov each voluntarily bring offerings to God. At no point does God demand any of these sacrifices. The only two possible exceptions to this rule prove upon analysis not to be exceptions at all. During the Brit Bein HaBetarim, the covenant between the pieces, this is of course something we'll reference on Seder night and the Haggadah, God commands Abraham to slaughter a series of animals and divide each animal into two. Passing through the pieces, God then reveals to Abraham a prophetic vision of the Israelites' eventual descent into bondage and their ultimate redemption. On a level of pshat, however, the scholars maintain that the animals used in this ritual are not offerings in the classical sense. Rashi, for example, explains that as God enacts a covenant with Abraham, God employs symbolism common to the society of the time. It was the custom of those involved in a covenant to divide animals and pass through them, right? So not that it's not a ritual that involves or develops a relationship between the participant and God. It's just that ritual is a covenant ritual, not a sacrificial ritual. Okay, so if you're surveying the instances of animal-related worship in, Breshit and Shemot, and you're thinking, or Breshit at least, and you're thinking about this, this is not really a counterexample because it is it's a covenantal ritual, not a sacrificial ritual. 2. During Abraham's most dramatic test, and of course this is something that Rabbi Foreman develops as an example of a korban, so to speak, and Rabbi Golden here is suggesting it's slightly different. During Abraham's most dramatic test, Akedat Yitzchak, the aborted sacrifice of Yitzchak, God commands the patriarch to raise his son as an offering, right? V'ha'alehu sham la'olah, elevate him as an elevation offering. It comes to be called a burnt offering on the summit of Mount Moriah. This offering, however, never takes place. Abraham is stopped at the last moment by a heavenly angel. While the true purpose of the Akedah remains an ongoing subject of discussion, and see his analysis back in Bereshit, one aspect of the event remains unchallenged. The only offering actually brought on the summit of Mount Moriah occurs after Yitzchak is spared. At that point, Abraham, of his own initiative, offers a ram in place of his son. Right? It's not that God or the angel says, "Stay your hand, don't slaughter your son, slaughter that ram instead." The whole episode ostensibly ends, and then Abraham lifts up his eyes and sees the ram caught in the thicket, by its horns, and decides to offer it of his own initiative. Once again, the korban actually offered is not commanded by God. And lots to think about here. Kind of a fascinating concept. Yes, okay, Seth points out, taking advantage of a loophole since the episode is initiated with a God-requested korban. Yes, a fair critique. So he's evading it slightly just by pointing out that at the end it turns out not to be. A different route you could go might be, and again, you could critique this too, but a different route you might go might be to suggest that, what olah there means is something different than what it comes to mean later as a burnt offering, but I agree with you. By and large, this is a kind of a slippery point here, but okay, we'll take it as it is. Everything changes, however, centuries later on the eve of the Exodus from Egypt. As the Egyptians brace for the final devastating plague, the Israelites retreat upon God's command to their homes. There, in separate family meals, they participate in the first God-commanded sacrifice recorded in the Torah, the Korban
Pesach.
Yep, there it is. Simultaneous with the birth of the Jewish nation, a divinely ordained sacrificial rite is born. Beginning with that event, korbanot become an integral part of Jewish tradition. Why do things change so dramatically with the birth of the Jewish nation? Why at this point are korbanot transformed from man-initiated to God-commanded rituals? Why does God now desire korbanot? Answers to these questions are suggested in the deliberations of the rabbis. Here we go, philosophical approaches. And now again, he's citing for us some of these, classic positions may be familiar to you. I think he adds at least a few things that were new or unfamiliar to me. Two separate approaches proposed by the Rambam, right, Maimonides, are central to the rabbinic discussion of korbanot. One, in his halachic magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam categorizes korbanot as chukim, mitzvot for which no reason is given in the Torah. While one is encouraged to seek meaning in such mitzvot, says the Rambam, God's true reasoning may well remain elusive. Shrouded in mystery, chukim such as korbanot emerge as a true test of our loyalty to God's will. 2. In his Guide to the Perplexed, however, the Rambam offers a vastly different rational approach to the inclusion of korbanot in Jewish law. And one, of course, needs to study the study of the differences between the way Rambam writes things in Guide of the Perplexed versus the Mishnah Torah, the general sense being that he wrote Guide of the Perplexed for the intellectual elite and Mishnah Torah for the, popular masses. So doesn't necessarily mean he thinks, I think it does mean he thinks one is more true than the other, but for now we're not getting into that and just recognizing them as two different approaches. In his Guide to the Perplexed, the Rambam offers a vastly different approach. Many phenomena in the Torah, he maintains, are based on the principle that abrupt major change in human behavior is impossible. Man simply cannot journey from one extreme to the other. God cannot expect the Israelites, reared in idolatrous surroundings replete with sacrificial rite, to totally reject rituals that they have come to see as necessary for communion with the divine. God therefore commands God's chosen people to sanctify the profane by adapting aspects of the prevailing sacrificial rite to God's worship within the sanctuary, meaning take what you see in the nations all around you, idolatrous sacrificial worship, and sanctify it by drawing its principles and some of its practices, into the service of the one true God. From this perspective, korbanot emerge as a divine concession to man's need, right? It doesn't go into here what the Rambam views as the ideal form, but generally speaking, it's meditation, contemplation of God. That's where we're aiming to get to, but you can't get there in a day. So the people, as the nation was being born, were given the concession of doing the divine service as a variation of the service they were familiar with, which is sacrificial service. The Israelites' difficult transition to their newfound faith is eased through the incorporation of a familiar ritual path. And I would say, by the way, for more development of this concept in the most modern time, Rabbi Yitzchak Greenberg's Triumph of Life, he really develops this idea about incremental change, as necessary, and when is it too slow and demands a revolution, and when is it appropriate for that slow pace, even while recognizing we're not where we want to get to, but we can't go any faster than this. While the Rambam's rational explanation for Korbanot in the Guide to the Perplexed sets off a firestorm of controversy among his contemporaries and later scholars, his observations may not be as revolutionary as they seem. The Rambam's theories, according to some authorities, are actually foreshadowed in an earlier midrashic source recorded in Vayikra Rabbah. Here from this midrash. Rabbi Pinchas said in the name of Rabbi Levi, the matter of sacrifices can be compared to the story of a prince whose haughtiness leads him to the consumption of despicable substances. The king determines, let my son attend my table regularly, and he will abstain from his evil doing of his own accord. Similarly, because the Israelites were drawn to idolatrous practices in Egypt and regularly sacrificed to pagan deities, the Blessed Holy One declared, let them offer their sacrifices before me at all times in the sanctuary, and they will separate themselves from idolatry. Even the Torah text itself, again, and he points out not everybody interprets the Midrash this way, etc., is what to talk about, but at least we have some sense of a recognition that we were, we couldn't totally free ourselves from what we saw around us, and so some version of, translating, importing that into the divine system was, the way to take that next step. And Seth's comment, from a sociological point of view, this makes sense, but then how does the Rambam explain why so much ink is spent on this temporary way station? Right, that's a great question. We have to say sort of that, while the Torah is timeless, it still was the book that was written for the people of that time, and so it incorporates that. A different approach would be to argue that the principles within each of the sacrifices, this is again more the direction that Rabbi Foreman goes, the principle within each of the sacrifices is still, you can extrapolate from the laws and details the core modes of relating to God, etc., and then bring them forward to some future set of rituals. But yes, again, still a good question. Even the Torah text itself, he goes on, seems to lend credence to the Rambam's approach with the following commandment concerning the centrality of the temple service. And they shall bring their offerings to the entrance of the tent of meeting to the Kohen, and they shall no longer slaughter their offerings to the demons after whom they stray. Right? Sometimes we gloss over this pasuk in the Torah, but you stop, slow down and read it, and you're sort of scratching your head like, wait, what? Right? So there's clearly a recognition of some kind of pagan worship that was the precursor, or was just the prior practice of the Israelites, before they had centralized worship and, divinely prescribed worship. Finally, the Rambam, so this is again him pointing out, yeah, we all know that position of the Rambam, but it's actually not so, out of nowhere as you might think. Finally, the Rambam's suggestions also find support in the earlier described historical development of Korbanot in the Torah. Sacrifices emerge as man of his own initiative determines a mode of communication with the divine. With the birth of the Jewish nation, God recognizes the Israelites' continuing need for such symbolic communication and allows for the retention of the sacrificial rite in God's newly given law. So that's broadly approach number one. And now we're going to see approach number two. Or maybe we've seen two. We saw the Rambam saying these are inscrutable laws, and so therefore we have no idea whether they're meant to evolve or not. It seems like maybe not. This is just the way God. We don't understand why God wants these sacrifices, but that's what God wants. That's the Rambam in Mishnah Torah. Two is the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim with its various kind of potential precursors, which is the idea that this is a stage along the way. And then we have the questions we might ask about that, like Seth did, why so much ink, etc. But and that's connected to other instances in the Torah and the Breshit history of Korbanot. Many authorities defend the Rambam's rational explanation for the existence of korbanot in Jewish law. Numerous other scholars, however, remain severely critical of the Rambam's approach, unwilling to categorize the Torah's extensive, detailed sacrificial rite as a concession to human frailties, right? And maybe along with it, unwilling to imagine that the Torah would spill so much ink on something which was going to be so temporary or so non-ideal. After dismissing the Rambam's proposals as empty words which address a deep concern in superficial fashion, tough critique, the Ramban quotes an alternative approach for those seeking a rational foundation for korbanot. The Ramban himself prefers a mystical approach, but for us rationalists, he gives us something to work with. Sacrifices are offered, he notes, in large measure as a response to man's failure and sin. God, therefore, designs the steps of the sacrificial rite to correspond to the three components of human activity through which sin occurs: thought, words, and deeds. Sins committed through deed are addressed through the ritual of smicha, whereby the individual bringing the korban lays his hands upon the animal prior to its slaughter. Sins committed through speech are reflected in the vidoi, the verbal confession offered by each supplicant. Finally, the sinful thoughts and desires that have coursed through the supplicant's heart and soul are referenced through the animal's consumption in the fire of the altar and through the sprinkling of its blood. As an individual witnesses and participates in these graphic rituals, he's forced to recognize the extent of his own sinfulness and culpability. Were it not for God's merciful acceptance of this korban in his stead, the petitioner himself would have merited a place upon the altar. Right? Again, this is broadly, this is an approach which seems to locate itself more in, korban as expiatory atonement, based things. We do have korbanot of other forms, just straight up gifts to God, expressions of thanksgiving, fellowship, etc. But the Ramban seems to locate his approach slightly more in that, chatat, asham, guilt, sin offering dimension. Numerous additional approaches to the concept of korbanot are offered within traditional literature. Following are several of them. Rav Sadia Gaon maintains that the sacrificial rite enables the Israelites to demonstrate the depth of their dedication to God by offering of the best of their possessions. The Baal HaChinuch, that's the Sefer HaChinuch, early medieval period, remains true to his general postulate that a person's thoughts and sentiments are shaped in great measure by his concrete actions, right? Acharei ha'pu'ulot nimshachot halebavot. The heart is drawn after the deeds. Therefore, the performance of symbolic mitzvot is thus critical to the process of attitude formation. A sinner cannot purify his heart simply through a passive confession between himself and the wall. Such confession requires no real effort and therefore has minimal effect. If, however, the individual is forced to act, if he becomes obligated in a demanding series of atoning rituals, if he must select from his flock, bringing his offerings to the sanctuary, and participate in the detailed sacrificial rite, he will then become acutely aware of the extent of his sin, and he will avoid such failure in the future. The Baal HaChinuch also suggests that the very act of offering a korban reminds man of the tenuous nature of his own superiority over the beasts of the field. Man's distinctiveness lies in his ability to reason. When an individual's reasoning fails and he consequently sins, that individual loses his status as a human and becomes no different from the animal. The Torah therefore commands the sinner to offer a korban in the sanctuary. The slaughter of the animal and the consumption of its remains upon the altar graphically demonstrate that a reasonless being is valueless and ultimately destined to destruction. The depth of the supplicant's failure and the toll of that failure upon his soul are thus underscored. Again, this leans more towards the sin, guilt-related korbanot, but still, overall gives us a sense of our frailty and our need to lean into our dimensions that make us unique as humans over animals as we kind of behold this process. For his part, the Maharal of Prague perceives the sacrificial rite with its intimations of mortality as a fundamental reflection of the inconsequentiality of all creatures in the face of God's greatness. Nothing exists in the world except as a result of God's kindness and munificence. Finally, numerous commentaries move beyond general explanations. I alluded to this when I mentioned Rabbi Foreman earlier, for the phenomenon of korbanot and painstakingly analyze the symbolic significance of each detail of the temple ritual. We will encounter some of their observations in our continued analysis of the book of Vayikra. Okay, so a quick survey Have a lot of different approaches. Again, the footnotes are there if we want to follow up on them further. Perhaps the most telling aspect of the Torah's sacrificial rite, however, is the most obvious. The vast majority of korbanot are simply not sacrifices in the commonly accepted sense. With singular exceptions, such as the olah, the burnt offering, which was consumed in its entirety upon the altar, portions of every korban are designated as food for the kohanim, their dependents, and or the individuals bringing the offering to the temple. Even more, the very first obligatory korban recorded in the Torah, the korban Pesach of the Exodus, was in its entirety a family meal. Yes. No altar was present, no temple service involved. The Israelites were instead commanded on the eve of the Exodus to physically consume the paschal lamb within the sanctity of their homes and to burn the remainder in the morning. What then defines the paschal lamb as a korban? How does this puzzling seminal ritual set the stage for the entire sacrificial rite to follow? Now, by the way, it's a huge assumption. He's loading a lot onto the Korban Pesach to say, like, this is the foundational, this is the kind of paradigmatic Korban. We don't have to say that. It's just the first one. Maybe it's a transitional one, right for its moment, but not descriptive or definitive of the system of Korbanot that's going to follow. But, to build this narrative arc, and we could still certainly make the argument that he wants to make that this is somehow setting the stage for what korbanot are supposed to be, and if so, then his argument will follow. Shouldn't each korban, why were portions of so many of the later korbanot designated as food? Shouldn't each korban have been a true offering to God, consumed entirely in flames upon the altar? We are forced, it would seem, to re-examine our understanding of korbanot. In contrast to classical sacrifices consumed entirely on the altar, korbanot were in large measure shared meals with God. Faced with the naturally developing distance between man and his Creator, forced to address the separation from God that results from the sin, the Torah proposes a path astonishingly profound in its simplicity. Invite God to your table. By the way, Rav Shai held, I think, I think the essay that was on the Korban Todah, spoke about invite others to your table more than invite God to your table. Again, all these dimensions are present. A korban, deriving from the root karov, to draw near, is the mechanism through which an individual can begin to repair and reestablish his relationship with a personal God. Just as in the human realm, a shared meal is a powerful relational tool, so too a meal consumed with God's symbolic participation can begin to address God's estrangement from our lives. Seth, I'll come to your comment in just a moment. Consumed with pomp and circumstance in the very shadow of the holy temple, with some portions placed upon the altar and others shared with the priests and often with the supplicants themselves, each korban became a potentially powerful rehabilitative tool. God's presence as an invited, honored guest was palpable and concrete. To the participants, these observances were far from meaningless rituals. They were instead shared meals with God, the first steps back to a fuller awareness of the divine in their lives. Seth writes, there's a big difference to me between this original korban and the ones in Vayikra. In Egypt, each family is alone. At the temple, people have to come together. Yes, another good point. And lots to think about in the difference between the Korban Pesach and really all other korbanot. There's a fascinating analysis of the Korban Pesach. Rabbi Shmuel Hain, I think, talked about this in his Shabbat HaGadol Drasha last year, which is actually the dimensions, the ways in which it's a Korban Yachid, an individual sacrifice, and the ways in which it's a Korban Tzibur, communal sacrifice. It sort of crosses those boundaries back and forth in a number of interesting ways. But yes, it's another difference. Okay, so this is sort of what he wants to cover by way of looking back, and now we're going to look forward. What, however, of the future? Do we truly anticipate a return to sacrifices as maintained in our prayers? Or is the sacrificial rite rooted in a past from which our nation has moved on?
Right, that's my question.
Okay, Peter, here we go. The vast majority of classical Jewish thinkers insist that our final redemption will feature not only the rebuilding of the temple, but a full return to the sacrificial rite. Wow. Particularly noteworthy is the position of the Rambam. In spite of this scholar's willingness to postulate the origin of korbanot as a concession to man's limitations, he gives no indication that this earthly origin limits the future applicability of these rituals. After dedicating major portions of his Mishnah Torah, his practical compendium of laws, to the strictures surrounding Korbanot, the Rambam clearly states towards the end of that work, the Messianic king is destined to rise in the future and reestablish the kingdom of David, to build the temple, and to gather the dispersed people of Israel. In his day, all the laws will return to their original state. Korbanot will be offered. The Shemitah and Yovel years will be observed. Anyone who does not believe this or does not await his, that is the Mashiach's arrival, not only denies the words of the prophets, but denies the Torah and Moshe, our teacher. Now, he doesn't cite anything else. There is a more robust analysis of the Rambam's position, which is debated, in which people, argue that perhaps the Rambam, based on what he says in Moran Avuchim, in the Guide of the Perplexed, does think that a future temple might not include the sacrificial system, but the Rambam is a little cagey about it. He's never quite so sharp and clear. It's hard to say definitively that he argues that we won't have it, sacrificial system returning in a future temple, but there is a little more robust analysis and debate of the Rambam's position across the spectrum of his writings than I think Rabbi Golden lays out here. But that's something you can kind of Google and research if you want. A solitary alternative position, and again, I'm not sure it's fully solitary, but it's certainly a minority position, is raised by the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel, Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. After first maintaining that with regard to sacrifices, it is correct to believe that all aspects will be restored to their place, Rav Kook builds on Kabbalistic literature and envisions a distant time when all aspects of the world will be elevated. At that time, he states, humans will no longer need to take the lives of animals for their physical, moral, or spiritual needs. The prophet Malachi perhaps references this future period when he states, then the grain offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to God as in the days of old and as in former years. That's Malachi chapter 3, and we say it at the end of the postscript to the Amidah, V'arva Hashem minchat Yehuda v'Yerushalayim kimei olam u'chshanim kadmoniot. Right. The point, as he goes on to say, strikingly absent from Malachi's vision is the reinstatement of animal offerings. It doesn't mean that he didn't think there would be, but it is noteworthy that that's what he talks about when he talks about a future reinstatement, is the grain offerings. The Midrash seems to go even further with the startling prediction, with the exception of the Thanksgiving offering, the Korban Todah, all sacrifices will be nullified in the future. Now, there was still an animal offering there, but an interesting limitation. To further strengthen his position, Rav Kook identifies a series of clues within the Torah itself, which he claims reflect the secondary status of animal sacrifices. These offerings remain appropriate as long as man makes use of animals for other needs, such as food and clothing. The time will come, however, when man, reaching his highest state of refinement, will no longer feel the need to take animal life for any purpose. At that point, only grain sacrifices will be offered in the temple. Okay? So we have that idea attributed to Rav Kook. Here now we come to the end of his sort of textual analysis, and now he adds a lovely story, which I enjoyed, in Points to Ponder. So I'll read that, and then we'll pause for questions and comments. A number of years ago, I fielded a strange phone call in my synagogue office. I represent, the caller said, a group of Korean Christian ministers who, in the interest of studying comparative religions, would very much like to visit your synagogue during a Sabbath morning service. This is Rabbi Golden's voice, I was immediately struck by two concerns. Firstly, I wondered how my congregation would react when a group of Korean Christian ministers walked in en masse without warning one Shabbat morning. Secondly, and more importantly, I wondered what the ministers themselves, absent prior preparation, would make of our service. They would not understand the language, the rituals would be alien and difficult to follow, and to top matters off, the apparent lack of decorum would be startling. This was before our synagogue's successful efforts at decorum improvement. Right? How would these ministers respond, for example, to children running up and down the aisles, to groups of adults talking at various points and on various topics during the service? The entire prospect carried, it seemed to me, potential for disaster. I therefore made a stipulation. The group would be welcome, I said, as long as they were willing to come to the synagogue beforehand for a private briefing with me. At that time, I would explain the various symbols within the sanctuary, the nature of our service, and our approach to prayer. We would then schedule and announce their Shabbat visit to the community, thus preparing my congregation for their appearance. The caller readily agreed, and the date was set for my preliminary meeting with the group at the synagogue. Having spoken before to groups of other faiths about Judaism, I knew that I had to be prepared for the unexpected during the question period that would inevitably follow my presentation. It's always difficult and at the same time refreshing to view our traditions through the eyes of total outsiders. On one such previous occasion, for example, the first question raised by a group of Catholic school children was, "What is the significance of the different colored skull caps that you wear? Do they represent a hierarchy within your tradition?" Armed by this time with years of experience, however, I felt prepared for whatever might come my way. Early on a Thursday morning, therefore, I found myself in conversation with a group of roughly 20 Korean Christian ministers in the main sanctuary of my synagogue. After reviewing some of the philosophical and practical particulars of our Shabbat service, and after showing them various ritual items such as the Torah scroll, the Aron Kodesh, and the Ner Tamid, I opened the floor for questions. There was a moment of silence. Suddenly a hand shot up. "Rabbi, where do you do the animal sacrifices?" "What?" I stammered, completely caught off guard. "Where do you do the animal sacrifices?" Regaining my composure, I began to explain that animal sacrifices were indeed a part of our tradition, but that they had been suspended since the destruction of the temple. My visitors, however, would not let go. For 45 minutes they continued to pepper me with educated questions concerning animal sacrifices, convinced that somewhere, somehow, I was hiding a goat or cow in the basement of the synagogue. Halfway through the session, I began to realize what was really happening. The assumptions of my guests actually said more about the foundations of their own faith tradition than about mine. Fundamentalist Christians, these ministers were driven by a simple developmental equation. Man, tainted with sin, cannot relate to God directly. To address this basic problem, the Old Testament, he puts in air quotes, therefore, or in quotes, therefore, mine were the air quotes, his are real quotes, prescribes a temple rite in which offerings of animals and grain enable man to gain atonement and approach an unfathomable God. These sacrifices serve as substitutes upon the altar, taking the place of the sinners themselves and redeeming them from sin. Upon entering the world stage, however, Christianity moves past the primitive temple rite by substituting the death of Jesus for the sacrifices. When Jesus dies for the sins of man, he replaces the animals on the altar and becomes the essential intermediary between limited man and a limitless God. The possibility that Judaism could be practiced without sacrifices was, therefore, to the minds of my guests, simply unthinkable. Given our lack of belief in Jesus, how else could we relate to an unreachable God? Only a Judaism incorporating sacrifices as intermediaries between man and the divine could serve as a precursor to their own faith system. No amount of persuasion on my part could therefore convince my guests of Judaism's fundamental belief in a direct relationship with God without intermediary. No explanation of the sacrificial rite as symbolic or educational in purpose could sway them from their firm assumptions. While my guests and I parted ways agreeing to disagree, and while their Shabbat visit to my congregation a few weeks later went without a hitch, their powerfully mistaken assumptions concerning korbanot have haunted me for years. Not because they need to know the truth, but because we do. I find myself wondering how many of my students or congregants would have been able to respond to the questions raised by the ministers who visited my synagogue those many years ago. How many Jews today give even a second thought to the purpose and significance of the sacrificial rite within our tradition? We understandably avoid confrontation with the elements of our tradition which, like korbanot, are difficult to comprehend and uncomfortable to encounter. Such evasion, however, cedes the intellectual high ground to those who would challenge our beliefs and question our traditions. As our brief study of korbanot has demonstrated, every element of the Torah is filled with relevant meaning and message. We avoid the discovery and study of those messages to our own detriment and at our own risk. So, happy to hear thoughts, questions, comments, your own thoughts about the place of korbanot in our tradition, or all the ink that's spilled, about them in the Torah. Any reactions as we have now embarked on our new book, our new season with Rabbi Shmuel Golden. Yeah, Lance, go ahead.
So I have. Oh,
Oh,
okay.
Peter, go
let
ahead,
Peter
please,
go.
Peter.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
What about Para Aduma? As soon as we get the third temple, which is imminent, are we all going to be unclean by that new structure?
Right.
And Para Aduma, the water to be clean.
Right.
Where is that planned?
That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head what the Rambam or Rav Kook would say about it. But yes, if as the Rambam writes, all the laws are restored, then in order to resume some sacrificial system from a place of purity, we would need to cleanse ourselves from tumat mate, and the only system we have, as far as I know, is the para aduma. So that is another challenge to what the
Yes.
future will look like. Yeah, it's good. It's a good point. Absolutely. Lance, go ahead.
Okay, number one, the temple sacrifice for me is equivalent to the sacrifice in baseball because in both cases, you give up something in order to get something, something that's very valuable to you. Um, Secondly, and I think equally important, is that the Christian Korean ministers were right on target because their expectation of an animal sacrifice, they're in the wrong right church, wrong pew, or wrong church, right pew, whatever you want to call it. They need to go to Samaria, and they need to
Oh
go
yeah.
with the Samaritans, who in just a few days or a couple of weeks are going to sacrifice the Paschal lamb, which, by the way, in the Torah is something that's supposed to go on forever. Now, there
Yes.
are, my understanding is there are Kohanim in Jerusalem who've been trained to do this in Temple Mount, but the
Yes.
state of Israel forbids it. The state of
Mm-hmm.
Israel could care less about the Samaritans because the Samaritans are not considered Jews. And the Samaritans are not considered Jews by rabbis. Why? Because at the Common Era, the rabbis hated the Samaritans. The rabbis thought the Samaritans were third-class citizens, and they still do to this day.
Mm.
And I take that personally, by the way. And there was another thing I was going to say. Oh yeah, as I think I mentioned this in another class. This whole business about the third temple is fascinating to me because at the end of Pekudei, we have the cloud of glory, and what is that associated with?
Cloud of
Hashem.
glory.
The Mishkan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have the Mishkan is the first temple, and then we have two versions of the second temple, the Solomon's temple and the second temple, and then we have the third temple, which is
Coming.
nope, it's here right now. We
Oh,
got it.
state of Israel.
Nope, it's the Sukkah.
Oh, that's right. You
And there are
mentioned
two
it last
rabbis
time.
in the Talmud. One is Akiva. I
Yes.
do not remember the name of the other one. Akiva says the sukkah is a shack. The other rabbi, however, says the sukkah is connected to the cloud of glory. And
Wow.
also, you're talking about, oh, I know what I was going to say. Finally, the whole business of keeping clean is satirized and criticized in the parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, in which a Kohen and a Levi see a dead body, or they think it's a dead body, and they walk away so they don't become unclean, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
Good
Yes.
Samaritan, the Good Samaritan doesn't act out of compassion and mercy as a Christian would, because the Good Samaritan represents the Samaritans. And in this case, the Samaritans are people who do not, the Good Samaritan operates without reward. He doesn't expect reward. It's chesed shel emet.
Mm.
That is the big difference between all of this business about sacrifice and all this business about Berach and all this other stuff, prayers, versus doing something for no reward. That's, and from my point of view, and I don't think I'm alone, that's the model for mitzvot in Judaism, at least from my perspective.
Wow. Great stuff, Lance. Thank you. Thank you. Just taking it all in and turning to Seth.
I have to say, I really appreciated the introduction. I'm glad you sent it to us. I thought that was quite beautiful. And I also appreciated the fact that he didn't gloss over the third temple. Like
Mm-hmm.
every
Mm-hmm.
day we say something about it.
Yep.
So I guess my perspective on this is that the a korban, meaning to draw closer, same root. I liked what he had to say about a shared meal
Yes.
because the way I think about it is the reason why there's so much ink spilt is that to become intimate with God is a little dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, on Mount Sinai, when Moses goes up with Nadav and Avihu and the elders, and they see God with the sapphire floor, and then they eat and drink, the rabbis don't think that that's so great. In fact, it maybe is the reason for the disaster that happens in 2 weeks. But this is like setting the love language for God. It's like, yes, we want to be intimate, but there's rules and ways to do it in which we'll come together as opposed to be burnt. I guess
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what speaks to me about
Beautiful.
all of the ink that's spilt here.
Beautiful. Love that. Love that. Yeah, Rabbi Shai held in his intro in Heart of Torah and Vayikra, I think also talks about it as like this highly ordered world, which is almost meant to be like this little oasis of utopian perfection, mirroring the world as it was created, because the only way to draw near is in this highly, ritualized, concretized, instructional sort of mode. Yeah, great. Lance, back to you for a last word.
Okay, last word. Professor Jacob Wright, writing in the Torah.com, contends that the original Shabbat was a communal feast at the time of each full moon, once a month.
Yep.
Now, in other words, that I think the idea of having a communal simcha with God is one thing, but that implies an anthropomorphic theophany. But what is critical to me is that we are going to celebrate. We are going to have a communal simcha on Pesach, on a night of the Paschal Lamb sacrifice, and that to me is really important. Equally important to me is that in the book of Joshua, when you have the first Pesach, the first Paschal Lamb, there is no mention whatsoever of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why is that? Unleavened bread is one of the things that they eat at that time. It is also the time that the manna stops falling. But there is, how could it possibly be that suddenly everybody in the Israelite world forgets about the Feast of the Unleavened Bread? How could that be? The only reason I think is the book of Joshua comes first.
Interesting.
It only makes sense to me.
Okay, great. Warrants further research. Okay, stay tuned. I think I may have something next Monday night, so we may try to adjust to Tuesday or Wednesday if possible. We'll send out an email. We'll send out the essay, and look forward to continuing our learning. So welcome aboard for Vayikra, and great to be with everybody. Have a great
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
Pleasure. Thanks.